Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson, and if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate the show. That helps people to discover it on Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, and it's also on Rumble. Enjoy the episode.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
Susan, I really do appreciate you doing this. It's been an honor to start reading your work and now be able to speak to you from across the world. So thank you.
The world.
I'm in Arizona.
Oh, wonderful. I've been many times to consciousness conferences in Tucson and sometimes driven from LA just for the fun of driving through all the beautiful desert.
I was looking at some of the upcoming conferences and I've seen that you've been there quite a few times. And I've been listening to you speak, and I read your book that you wrote in 1999, The Meme Machine, and I would love to dive deep into that a little bit, like your updated thinking on memes. But first, I'd love to just give the audience a little bit of an overview of how you got so enamored in this field of exploring consciousness, because I know your story a little bit, but the others might not. So,
well, at the risk of boring the ones who do, because I feel I've talked about it too much, it all goes down to one experience that I had in 1970 when I was a student. It was my first year at Oxford, my first term at Oxford. And I just got sort of slightly involved in the Psychical Research Society there, mainly because I kind of fancied the guy who ran it, and he asked me if I'd join and help him organize the society. So we had sort of witches and mediums and other people come to talk to us. And we did Ouija board sessions and all sorts of stuff like that. And one night after a meeting late, I was deeply sleep deprived, and we'd been doing this Ouija board session, which is not a sensible thing to do and can make you feel a bit, your hands going like this, you feel a bit sort of disconnected and weird. I'm saying this because these were the things that led up to this experience. And then I went back to a friend's room in college to have a smoke, cannabis, and had a small amount. And I can remember feeling a bit not quite with it and not quite right. And I didn't want to smoke much. And my two friends were chatting away. And I was sitting there listening to music. And I wish I could remember what it was, but it was probably Grateful Dead or Pink Floyd or something wonderful like that. And in this music, I was going down a tunnel towards, it was a tunnel of leaves towards a light at the end. And it was like a roaring noise was going down, like I was sort of galloping down this tunnel, Now, you have to understand that in 1970, the term near-death experience hadn't yet been coined. That wasn't till 1975. And I'd never heard of tunnels and lights. I mean, this whole thing was completely unexpected to me. I'd heard of astral projection, and I sort of faintly, I was studying physiology and psychology, for goodness sake. So astral projection was kind of not on the syllabus of at university. But I'm just explaining what I knew because of how surprising it was what happened. Because there were certain things I knew, but not much. Anyway, going down this tunnel, and then one of my friends said, did I want any coffee? And I couldn't answer. I was just like gripped in this tunnel. And my other friend said to me, where are you, Sue? Which is kind of weird because I was sat there on the floor right in front of him. And I struggled. I really couldn't answer properly. And it was as though everything cleared, this tunnel disappeared, and I was on the ceiling looking down at the whole room. And I saw the mouth down there speaking and saying, oh, I'm on the ceiling, I can see you. And, I could see myself and the others and so on. And so this was the beginning of what turned out to be more than 2 hours of extraordinary experiences, which began with what you could say was classic astral projection, but I don't believe any longer in the theory that there's an astral body that leaves. But, I went off flying. I went to try and investigate things. I looked at the roofs and gutters and things above to see if I could check the next day that they were right, which they weren't, but that's another long story. And I went all over the place, and various adventures happened to me, and lots of frightening things and lots of wonderful things. And I tried to come back, and I found I could come back. And so I thought, oh, fine, that's not a problem then. There's lots of people who have out-of-body experiences are afraid they'll never come back, or their body will die without them, or it's just not true. But I can understand totally why people might think that. So anyway, I went off again. And when I eventually came back after some more adventures and changing shape, I became, to begin with, I had been like a replica of our body schema. I had sort of wispy, ghost-like arms and legs and head and whatever. But by this time, I was what actually would technically be called an asomatic out-of-body experience. No body, just kind of point of awareness. And I came back, and I found that, well, I wanted to go back inside the body and look out through the eyes. It's fascinating now to look back and think, well, that is the illusion of self reconstructing itself, having been blown apart. But anyway, I got too small, and I went inside the body and became just, like tiny. And I was looking at the body from inside. Well, obviously at my imagined body from inside, which is now, I learned later, it's called internal heotoscopy. But anyway, it doesn't matter. It's an unusual experience, but people sometimes have it. And so I tried to get bigger. And this is where it became interesting, because whatever that was at the point, seemed to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, beyond the room, beyond the country, beyond the planet, beyond the solar system, beyond, to the point that I became everything. And there was no self, no distinction between self and other. Just in some way, there wasn't nothing. There was, it's very hard to say at that point, but there was just space. And then I couldn't speak, obviously, because there wasn't any context of anything, or time had kind of disappeared. But my friend kept asking me questions, and at some point he said, well, there must be something more. And I kind of went, as it were, dragged myself into existence. But then everything sort of popped, and it was just as though there was some kind of sense of somebody or something, some awareness that was there, that wasn't me, but wasn't separate from me. I don't know. These things are very hard to describe. And the reason I bother describing is because I've subsequently discovered, as my life has gone on, what was happening, which I didn't understand at all. And I think those are the fifth and sixth jhanas, which are described in the early Buddhist sutras, but I had no idea then. And after this kind of opening into there being just awareness, I had to get back. And I really had to reconstruct, as I would put it now, reconstruct the illusion that I'm Sue, that's my body, I'm going to be in that body. And I can remember saying to myself things like, if you want to go anywhere, you've got to take the body with you, which seemed so horrible. I've been free and free in the universe, and now I've got to take that body with me. Anyway, I've talked long enough, sorry, but that's the trouble
No,
with
I love
asking
it.
that question. I tend to
It's
go on about it. But you can imagine that as an 18-year-old, 19-year-old student studying what we knew then of the brain, which is so little compared with now, and rats running in mazes and dissecting brains and that kind of thing that I was doing, this was like, whoa, far out. And I decided then I'm going to devote my life to parapsychology and proving that there's another world and astral bodies and all that, which, well, didn't quite work out the way I'd expected. But that's where it began. And to actually answer your specific question, after 20 or more years of actually trying to do parapsychology and trying to prove the paranormal and all of that, I decided that that was a complete red herring, and that the real question that I wanted to study was the problem of consciousness.
I
So
really
that's a
appreciate you
long,
sharing
long
that.
answer for
No,
why
I
I've
think
ended up being obsessed with what is consciousness.
it's a good thing to share, though, because a lot of people don't ever have those experiences, and the people that do don't necessarily always find the track that you did to get that obsessive and to actually go and use the scientific method. And what I like about you, too, from what I've gathered, is like your Zen meditation practices. You have an introspective practice, a subjective explorative practice, too, a contemplative practice that a lot of the scientists that I speak to and a lot of people that are in the field of exploring consciousness, I feel like they sometimes veer away from the subjective explorative process, from what I gather, and they've never had a psychedelic experience. They don't use cannabis, and not to dismiss any of that. It's just interesting because with you spent the hundreds of thousands of hours, if not more, exploring in that way, which I think is profound. And I like when people mix the two, east and west and inner and outer, and come back with some things. And to me, I really like with the hard problem that you don't seem to cling to any theories. You seem to just be curious and to keep exploring and to not necessarily have an overarching theory, which I appreciate. So when did the memes
That's been true
thing?
for that's been true for a long time, that I haven't had a theory. And do you know how many theories there are? There's an amazing website called Landscape of Consciousness by Robert Kuhn, and
I had him
he
on.
keeps adding more theory. Have you seen it? Yeah,
Yeah, and I actually had
and he keeps
Robert
adding
Kuhn
more
on the
theories.
podcast.
Oh, brilliant! Great. Well, I've known him for decades. I did one of his earliest Closer to Truth videos, long, long ago. Um, and he is now listing, I think it's 364 different theories of consciousness. Now,
Hmm.
I don't want to throw another theory into that mess, but what I have tried to do is to work out why we're so deluded about consciousness, because they think you need to do that before you can even begin with a theory. I do have kind of inklings of where I think a theory might be going that might work, and just not be to do with the hard problem at all, just get out of that. But that's another story. I would say that the whole field of consciousness studies is in trouble. I mean, any field of science or philosophy that has 364 theories competing with each other has got to have a problem.
Yeah, the landscape was amazing. The article that has all those theories, I actually went through it and then had him on, and it just makes you realize just how far off we are from being even close to pinning this thing down, which is great. To me, it makes it more interesting, right? And I think that's what I like about you. I'd love to hear at some point your theory, if anything, or at least where you think it's heading. Because I've even had like Michael Levin on and Nick Lane, some people that study developmental biology, and those guys are really interesting to me. They've got some things that make you realize just how consciousness is not at all what we think, and that's what I like about your work as well. But getting into the memes, I think you mentioned pretty recently that you're going to be reworking that theory out or writing about it again, if not making another book about memes. And I'd love to know like how things have changed since 1999 when it comes to thinking about memes, and then ask you some questions about what I have to push back on that a little bit and to also learn from you in real time.
Well, I don't know whether I'm going to be doing anything more. I met, so the original Me Machine was 1999, published by Oxford University Press. The only book of mine that has, really been successful, and it's extraordinary how it's gone on. I mean, it's so old, more than 25 years old, but people are still buying it and reading it. And so I talked to someone last year at OUP, and she was quite keen that I did a second edition. And then, so I was going to submit a proposal, and then she left OUP, and another person took over, and now he sounds as though he's quite keen, and I've sent in another proposal to do a second edition. So it will be kind of reworking of the book, but also updating, which after 25 years is quite a challenge. But anyway, that's what I'm hoping to do.
And what are some of the big updates, if you could share any, that you think have changed in your perspective from then? That's a long time away.
Well, there are lots. I think the most difficult one for me, the challenging one, is all the superb work that's been done in cultural evolution theory. So the idea of memes, when Richard Dawkins proposed this was in The Selfish Gene in 1976. And just for people who are not aware, this is not about internet memes. Internet memes are a tiny subset of memes. As Richard Dawkins described it, so the whole point about The Selfish Gene, the book and his work, was that evolution doesn't proceed for the sake of the species, nor even for the sake of the individual. What's really going on deep down, even though it's individuals who live and die and get eaten by lions or not, or run over by a bus or not, whatever it is, what's really happening is at the level of genes. Genes are competing to get reproduced, passed on. And so they are the replicator. And he just asked this fanciful question because he said the whole book was not really meant to be about genes. It was meant to be about the power of replicators, about the principle that information that is copied, varied, and selected and then do it again, and then do it again. Anywhere in the universe where that process happens, there will be evolution. So he said, are there any other replicators on planet Earth? And he answered his question by saying, well, look around, or you might as well look around here as anywhere. Everywhere you look is culture, is things that are passed on as information, copied and varied and selected. I mean, these books you can see behind me, even the plants and the plant pots and the radio and the light, these are all information that has competed. These books have won a competition to get into my library, and most books are not read very much, and very few books are read a lot. So that was the idea of memes, any information in culture. Now, what has happened since then, so that cultural evolution has become a really interesting topic for biologists and theoreticians, but most of them, so they've been studying in different cultures, like simpler cultures, different languages, and all sorts of things, how cultural evolution takes place. But they don't treat the cultural items or whatever as memes. They don't think of them as a replicator. So somehow in this new edition, if I do it, I have to not get too carried away because there's so much of that research. I need to do justice to all that research, which has made many interesting things, and explain the difference between memetics, which says all this information floating around here is a replicator. It's using us. It's using our brains, and it's forced our brains to get bigger in order to accommodate all these memes. And that's the process that's going on, and distinguish that from the people who would say, well, yeah, the big brain was driven by language and tool use and whatever, but it's not a replicator. So that's one big job. But then, of course, as I'm sure you can imagine, there's a chapter in 1999. I mean, the World Wide Web was 1994, was it? I think Tim Berners-Lee was experimenting with it in 91. I went to a conference in the 90s and met him and spoke in Hong Kong when the web was it was probably about 1998 or 9. And that was like, we couldn't have imagined then what it was going to be like now. So my book was written in that context. So now clearly I have to do the job of explaining what memes are very clearly, so people are not obsessed with internet memes. But then I need to use the whole of what's happening in the web without taking up too much of the last two chapters. So that will be a big updating. And I'm not into contemporary online culture at all. I'm going to have to get educated or find some children or something, to help me. And then finally, I will enjoy very much. You've mentioned my connections with Buddhism. I'm not a Buddhist, but with Buddhist practice, with East-West ideas and so on. And at the end of the Meme Machine, the original version, I talk about self and what we are as a self. And I don't think that will change hugely, but I've done an awful lot more meditation since and got deeper into these practices. So I will enjoy seeing if I can update that better with a bit about consciousness and where I think we're going with that.
Awesome. I would love to read that if it ends up being something that you go through with. I know that would be a daunting task, but it seems like you can write pretty ferociously. Yeah. I ended up listening to, at some point, your debate with Jordan Peterson, and I loved how you pushed back and kept it cordial, and you did a nice job on that. And because he can get pretty carried away with his stuff. And one of the things that I heard him say was that with his idea, I don't want to take words out of his mouth, but there was an element to it where he said if it replicates over time that long, that it's correct. And I didn't really agree with him there, that it means that it was correct. It's like, well, maybe it was just book burning and, persecution of certain cultures and murder and war, right? And that still holds true today. So it's like the strongest ideas and memes that carry on through time, if we're going to get into this, which I'd love to. I love to bring up like how much of an influence the cultural dynamics like propaganda, cultural engineering, like if you look at the social dilemma, which is something you're probably going to have to dive into for this new book, the updated version of your meme book, the way that social algorithms have been played for incentivization structures to drive attention, So you can actually control memes so much more powerfully now than ever. Throughout history, it was done through book burning and through war, but now it's done through meme control and algorithmic feedback loops with AI. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on memes carrying through time with technology and incentivization structures.
Well, where you began with that is absolutely to the point. That it's not the best memes that win, if by that you mean good, true, beautiful, helpful, any other positive things for us, because they don't care about us. Memes are just information using our brains to get copied. So this is the fundamental thing to remember, and that some people don't remember, which is that memes don't care. And any that it's the same as with genes, with any replicator. The ones that get replicated are the ones that have what it takes to get replicated. They are not necessarily the ones that are most useful for us at all. So we are surrounded by all kinds of memes that we would be better off without. You mentioned persecution and so on. There's a wonderful study by Martin and Boudry, two Belgian researchers, on the medieval witch prosecutions, witch trials. They did a sort of historical study of how they spread, asking so how the technique spread. You know, the way that witches were treated, and the ducking stools and the pricking method to find out if they were lying. All these horrible things, and huge amounts of murders and death and misery. To try and find out why these practices, as memes, spread. And the theories of historians previously had been that it must be to the benefit of the individual, the people who were prosecuting them, cardinals or whatever they were, and or that it was to the benefit of the society, or it must have been for the benefit of something, because it clearly wasn't for the benefit of genes, because lots of people were killed. And Martin and Boudry showed that none of those things could explain it, that nobody benefited. The prosecutors didn't benefit. In fact, there's history of them, hating having to do it, really. Obviously, the so-called witches didn't benefit, nor did their families, but nor did whole villages were just kind of laid waste, and social cohesion destroyed, and so on, by these memes that spread simply because they could spread, because somehow the idea of witches could easily take hold, and children would spread the idea, and so on and so on. So that's just a very good example of some research that really does back up memetics. But now, as you're implying, we are swamped with AI. I mean, right now, today, it's changing so fast, and it's terrifying. Um, I haven't done much with chatbots, but enough to realize how they can suck people in. People will take them into their lives and do what they say and follow them, not to their own benefit, not to the benefit of them or their family or their friends or anybody else, but to the benefit of the memes. It may not even be to the benefit of the people who started the memes in the first place. Memes will spread when they can. Now, I'm thinking that in fact, we need to think about it in terms of a third replicator. So, genes are the first replicator on this planet. According to Dawkins, memes are the second replicator. And I would say there is a third replicator, which is digitally based. Our memes are based on our behavior and our language and everything else. So the third replicator is based on not on behavior, but on copying digital information from place to place. And it's the same principle which you have described there, that the ones that succeed will not be the ones that be to our benefit, because the tremes, I don't have a good word for them, but the third replicator, tremes, they don't care any more than genes or memes care. They are just information, and memes are using our brains and bodies to replicate. Tremes are using all the apparatus we have provided for them, all the computers and servers and phones and all of that stuff. They are using that for their own benefit to be replicated. And they're using us to keep building that stuff and keep digging up the oil and keep making new solar panels and building enormous data centers. That whole process is being driven by the replication of dreams. And that's terrifying.
Yeah.
Our role,
It's
what's our role? Our role is not to be happy human beings using these things for our benefit. Our role is providing the energy for something that is definitely not for our benefit. Scary
right.
stuff.
Yeah, especially when there's big corporate funding and people from all different walks of life that have different incentives to drive the memes in certain directions for
Yeah,
profit or
yeah,
control. It's just
yeah,
very,
yeah.
very interesting times. How do you view AI? I've heard different people, especially I love talking to biologists about AI because they know that when you start to tamper with one component of biology, that there's a number of things that go way out of order, or there's just so many unintended consequences when you tamper with biology. And so it makes you realize that we just don't know what we're doing. And so that humility factor should be at play. But it seems to me that the technologists are missing that component, in my view. How do you view AI?
I don't know enough about the people you're talking about to have a strong view on that, but it's certainly very plausible. You can get very rich, you can get the admiration of other programmers and designers and what have you. You can have a interesting life contributing to the whole of the AI. And I mean, the people deeply involved in it are split really on how terrifying it is, how dangerous it is. I think I'm coming to the it's extremely dangerous end. Um, I don't, I mean, our brains are not designed, I mean, our brains were designed by the genes and competition to do their job of keeping us alive and keeping us carrying on with our genes. That has changed dramatically now we have memes. If you think about something I'm very interested in, the evolution of religions, um, it seems to me that the big God religions um, really benefit the genes. Well, they arise from genetic factors. You know, the men are in charge. The men are the ones who've got lots of sperm and that mate a lot. And the women are their possessions that are to be objects protected from any other man getting to impregnate them. And the whole religion, the oppression of women and so on, of that kind of thing in religions. That fascinates me. And on the other side of it, as culture, particularly Western educated cultures, have progressed away from that. The memes are more trying to be to the benefit of us human beings. So you get things like human rights law, which is an anathema. I mean, God hates human rights, you could say, because they don't do the job of benefiting the men who are spreading most genes. So we get into this with memes. Well, now we take a third step into the internet, into the digital world, and again ask about the benefit there, which is to the machinery and not to us. And yet, at the base of all of this are we frail human beings with our limited intelligence, our ridiculous emotions. I mean, they're not ridiculous in a biological context, but our emotions that are so easy to play with, the kind of images that people fall for, you know, sex. It's been the case. When I wrote The Me Machine I was writing in 97, 98. I used as an example going to my railway station where there'd be hundreds of magazines, and most of them have a sexy girl on it, whatever the topic is, because it attracts people's eyes. It's pathetic, isn't it? But that carries on. I mean, what are the rubbish that you get and the adverts and everything? These appeal to our lowest biological kind of grabbiness of the ideas, and that carries on. Now, take these kind of human beings who are now in charge of massively powerful artificial intelligences, which are rapidly escaping any control, but we are still inclined to fall for the adverts, the things that excite us
Yeah.
when they come on our screens. This is a very dangerous mixture. Um, just realizing that makes it clear how bad things could be,
Mm-hmm.
and then we look at how bad they are. And again, I'm not an expert studying what's happening, but you can see people easily being sucked into feeling that ChatGPT or whichever, Claude or something, is their friend, and taking the advice, which can be very good and get you, because it's based on searching so much stuff, and then that will lure you into doing things you would never do, and harmful to yourself and others. I think it's. I think we're all doomed. Sometimes I'm quite glad to be old because I'm not going to be around to see the worst of it. And then I think, yeah, but I'd love to see what happens. Sorry, that's very
That's
childish, but
awesome.
I'm just telling the truth about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you can be a rational optimist. That's somewhat what I am, where I don't expect anything to go in this fluffy rainbow butterflies way, but I'm also excited at the same time to be a part of it and to be aware of it and to be here for it. And we're all going to die anyway. So I like to celebrate that as a gift that makes us appreciate the moment. But there's a
That's a
component
very,
to
very
this.
positive attitude. That's a very positive attitude that I like very much and ought to adopt more myself. That I am so lucky to be able to be talking about these things and being able to write if I do the second edition. And yeah, remember that, Blackmore. Don't get too dismal and depressed about where it's all going. Be grateful that you have this chance and try and do your best
Mm-hmm.
to help in any way, if that's possible, to
Mm-hmm.
make it, to help people see what's happening, perhaps avoid the worst of it. I don't know. That's a
Yeah.
tall order. We'll see.
Yeah, and I'm imagining any time through history there was not just this utopia. It was always like some tyrant and some weird thing going on, and we would have been terrified of all of the technologies that we did create. So I try to just lean into it with curiosity and wonder and gratitude, but that just works for me to make me not be nihilistic and to not suffer, to be honest. And one of the things I like about you is your meditation practices. Yeah, being that you've meditated for years and you've been to these retreats and you have a deep meditation practice, and I actually do too. Years ago, I started to find those float tanks and I started to get deeply interested in stillness and breath work and yoga and all these things, even psychedelics. And I think now with the attention economy and AI and all of the things that we're just now describing, it's probably more important now than ever if we want to have any ability to navigate this new landscape, to unplug and have practices like the ones that you and I are speaking to not be just completely swept into the momentum of the meme space. And it seems to me, if we can talk about the illusion of self a little bit, because that's something that you've gone very deep into, and a lot of that can be observed only through introspection and awareness. You could study it objectively to some degree and you can read about it all day long. But if you never have the felt present experience of this weird illusion of self, then you're not going to have the ability to be immune to the cultural engineers or whatever this meme space is that's so exponential right now.
To some extent, I agree with you, but you're saying that you can't at all grasp the nature of the illusion of self without this kind of practice. Think about Dan Dennett, great friend of mine, and
Yep.
as you know, he died last year. Now, he has never meditated. Well, he told me, oh, well, I did try it once and I didn't like it. You know? He was, I would say, the most, I mean, I'm a great admirer of his work. In the end, I don't think his multiple drafts theory does the whole job and so on, but he was a master of showing the traps we fall into when we think about our minds, about ourselves, about our consciousness. And his absolutely wonderful book, 1991, Consciousness Explained, which some people rudely call Consciousness Explained Away, which I think is wrong. But what he was doing there was saying, look at this trap, look at this trap, look at this trap. We've got it wrong, we've got it wrong. And then giving exercises and examples and clever stories and funny tales to lure you into it. And the most relevant thing to what your question is was his idea of the Cartesian theatre. So Cartesian as in Descartes. So he said back in 1991, and I think it's still true now, that the majority of people working on consciousness, neuroscientists, philosophers, psychologists, and whatever, claim to be materialists, but they still believe in an inner place where I sit, experiencing a stream of consciousness going by, like a theatre with a screen inside my head. Now, it feels like that. I mean, not many people, if they really think about it, would disagree that it feels as though I'm inside here looking out through my eyes and so on. Now, he never did any of the kind of meditation you're talking about that would enable him to see things differently, but he could see straight away that there is no Cartesian theatre in the brain. It's a myth. And he said he called all the people, the so-called materialists who still believe in the Cartesian theatre, he called them Cartesian materialists. They're still dualists at heart. And I think that is still true. I think the whole field is still full of Cartesian materialists, which is a problem. I think it's the heart of the problem, really. So that's why, in that sense, I'm disputing your idea that you can't see the problem of the illusion of self without meditation, because he did. And when I first met him, which was literally in 1991, because I was lucky enough to go with Richard Dawkins and Richard Gregory, a great psychologist in Bristol. They were going to see him in Oxford giving a lecture on the book, and they invited me to go with them. And I met Dan, and we were going to dinner after the lecture, and we were walking down South Parks Road. It's one of those memories that stick with me in the science area in Oxford. And I said to him, well, I think it's wonderful the way so many of your ideas fit with what the Buddha was saying with the nature of self and so on. And he didn't need to draw himself up because he was extremely tall and I'm not. But he sort of looked at me and he said, well, don't you think if someone else had discovered this 2,000 years ago, I would know about it? I thought,
That's funny.
whoa. Oh, sorry, sir. Right. And I think that was, we went on to become great friends. And I find that quite an interesting memory. But the fact is, he got to a lot of those insights by a purely academic way, which is very different from getting there by experiencing for yourself the way that the self actually is fooling you in its nature. And of course, you asked me about my original experience, and that was one in which self both became equal to everything else or not at all existing, or all sorts of different things that can happen to the senses.
Yeah. And when Dennett was writing, do you know his writing process? Like, he had to have had a pretty deep contemplative practice, maybe not sitting like a normal meditation, but to even sort out the way that he did. And to write is somewhat of a form to get to those spaces, because you're following these curiosity paths, and you're sorting ideas and memes out. But to me, that is a very deep, rich, experiential practice, right? To write.
Yes, and he began that book by saying that he was sitting in a rocking chair, gently rocking backwards and forwards, listening to some classical music. I can't remember what it was that he said, and watching light flickering on the leaves outside the window. And this is what he wanted to explain. And a lot of people say he wasn't talking about consciousness at all, but that's what he was trying to explain. And beginning to do that by demolishing the false assumptions that we have. So that's a kind of contemplation. I think you're right, that, to an extent, to put it that way, that he was contemplating the nature of experience by sitting there in his rocking chair.
Yeah. Yeah, Einstein and many others were similar in that way, where they would have these states they would get into riding a bike or sitting on a bench, and that was where they were able to see and imagine themselves on the tip of a rocket. Some of the best physicists do the same thing. So it may not look like some Eastern meditation practice, but to me it's a rich inner, or maybe we don't have to call it inner at this point because it's an illusion of inner outer, but just that experiential subjectivity of it, the existential part of it, is always tied to it. So everything that we have as some form of theory is always an interpretation. I always think like we have an interpretation of it, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. But what you said about Einstein, I mean, Einstein did go on to make some very profound spiritual kind of statements, and Dan really didn't. He stuck more to the philosophy and the brain science. But yeah, I think most great scientists, if not all, have that quality of looking into ordinary, everyday things and seeing them differently and trying to work out what that means.
It's beautiful. So now that you have been studying consciousness for this long and being sort of obsessed with it, what are your leanings if you were to go and look at the next 5 to 10 years of where we're headed, and what would be the best theory, if any, that you would lean more into, like you were saying in the beginning of the conversation?
Well, where I'm going with it at the moment, but with, here's an idea I want to explore rather than here's my theory. And
Yes.
everything changed for me when I suddenly, rather belatedly, a couple of years ago really, came across predictive processing theory. Now, I'd encountered Bayesian maths and so on in my research a long time ago, but I'm no mathematician. I couldn't understand all that. So I'm pretty daunted by the thought that the whole of predictive processing theory depends upon Bayesian mathematics. But the basic ideas are fairly easy to understand without having to understand the maths and how Markov blankets work and all these kinds of things. So why is this so important? What are we trying to explain when we're trying to understand consciousness? So not everybody, but one of the weird things about the field of consciousness is we don't have a definition of what we're talking about. Nobody's come up with an agreed definition of consciousness. So, we all know what consciousness is. It's this, it's whatever. And people are free to have their own, whatever they think about it. It's a power, it does something, it evolves, it emerges from the brain, it's constructed by brain cells, or whatever kinds of things. And that's all a great muddle. So what people tend to go back to is the famous question by Thomas Nagel in 1974. Excuse me. What is it like to be a bat? And what's interesting about this is you're saying that it's the physical object that has something called consciousness, if you think about it that way, and that is very often how it's thought about. And you inevitably get into the hard problem that way. You can't avoid it, because what you're saying is there is a physical thing called the bat, and then there is or isn't this extra thing called consciousness that would make the bat be aware, or whatever effect you think it would have. And so the hard problem is basically insoluble. I mean, the way that Dave Chalmers described the hard problem when he coined that phrase in 1994 was, it's the problem of how subjective experience arises from brain activity, or arises from the objective activity of brains. And there's this idea that it arises, so which is a kind of dualist idea. It's got to be a kind of dualist idea. So you've got the physical thing, and then you've got this non-physical, subjective, what it's like to be, that arises. And there's your problem. And I think many people would agree that it's insoluble, although lots and lots of people try to solve it. Now, predictive processing is really, really interesting, because one of the weird things that's been known for decades, probably a century, is that there are more neurons going outwards towards the outside, towards the senses, than coming inwards. Now, the normal way that most people kind of think about their minds is, well, all this stuff comes in, comes in the ears, comes in the eyes, goes up the optic nerve, into the thalamus, up to the V1, and, blah, blah, blah. And then, da-da, you become conscious. Well, this is one of the things that in 1991, Dennett was saying that this can't be true, because it would be magic. You suddenly become conscious. And I think that's a sort of interpretation that many people make of, for example, global workspace theory. Oh, there's all this stuff happening, and then some of it gets into the global workspace, and bam, it becomes conscious. And you're stuck with this problem. Now, predictive processing theory, if I can just give it a very, very simplistic description, is the idea that that the brain is a complex hierarchy, and at the the top of the hierarchy, well, no, let's forget that. As complicated as whether there's a top or a middle or whatever. But at every layer in this hierarchy, what the neurons are doing is trying to predict what's coming in next. And they're doing this in order to not be surprised by what's coming next and be able to behave appropriately with what's coming in next. And how do they do that? They build models, guesses about the nature of what's out there. So at the lower levels in the retina, even where there are some cells, but certainly in V1, in vision, the cells are detecting lines and shapes and whatever, and predicting that that line's going to carry on that way. So this is what we're going to see now, and enables experience and behavior and so on. And so that's happening at every level of a very complex brain. And essentially, at the higher levels, the system is modeling an outside world. It's basically building predictive models, or generative models, they're called, of what is out there. We can never know what's out there, but all we can do is build representations or models. So where I'm going to answer your question is to say there's nothing it's like to be a bat or to be you or me. There is only something it's like to be the models, the predictive models that these systems build. Now, if that's a weird idea, it is a weird idea, but it has the following advantage. So if we say that this experience now, me sitting here in my room looking at the sky going dark, it's only 4:30 and it's getting dark already here in England, looking at all this brain is constantly building a model so that I've got the gist ready there in the higher priors in this system, that if I look that way, I'm going to see that plant. And if I look that way, I'm going to see the window. And this is my experience. And that's all there is. And so the what it is like, the subjectivity is what it's like is these models. Why does that make sense? To me, it makes sense because what is a model? It is a description of what something's like. These models going on here are descriptions of there's a world out there and the sky is kind of yellowy blue, kind of whatever. And it changes everything if you look at it that way, because you no longer have a hard problem. You do have a philosophical problem of the nature of anything, but what you have is that our consciousness is what it's like being these mental models. And that would apply at all levels. So I'm saying that all mental models constructed by a brain have a something it's like to be. And what it's like to be is what they're describing. So low down in the system, there are simple representations of objects and so on. There is a what it's like to be them, but I don't know about it because I, as Dennett said, and we've talked about already, I am a construction of something that doesn't really exist. I am a model of an inner self who is looking out through the eyes, and that is the self that we were talking about that can be dissolved, disappears in certain meditative states and so on. But it is the self that kind of fools us into thinking that I am a soul or a spirit or I'm in charge or whatever. So that's the kind of idea that I'm working with, and it is completely different from the other 364 theories. I wouldn't say it's quite a theory, but it's a different way of looking at the nature of consciousness. And it means that consciousness does not arise from anything. And there isn't any hard problem because it's utterly intrinsic to the process of predictive processing. That's all there is. There isn't a predictive processing model and some are conscious and some are not. All predictive processing models have a something it's like to be, and we are deluded by the way that we build the self model. And that's what dissolves, as you were describing in your own life, when you do a lot of contemplative practice. Sorry, I rambled on there, but it's quite weird to try to explain this, but I had a lot of fun trying to see where it goes and whether it does help us with the problem of consciousness at all.
No, it's fun listening to you speak, especially after years of exploring it. But it makes me think about three of the guests I've had on this show, going from Anil Seth, who talks a little bit about neuromania, and a lot of his stuff is really fascinating. And I'm excited to watch him throughout time because he's a fascinating guy that's brilliant. But then it leads me to Raymond Tallis. Those guys are so completely different. I had him on, and Raymond is so good at not clinging to any of these theories, and he's sort of ontologically, I forget how he called it, agnostic. That's what he said. And I loved that when he said, I'm ontologically agnostic. But he still really explores subjectivity and the existential component as primary, where we don't want to mix the map with the territory and get too hung up on these models or these theories as the primary. Which leads me to like Nick Lane, who's this incredible biologist that talks about complex conscious systems, like these systems that are maybe like bacteria or viruses or like things that don't have brains, that seem to operate with intelligence and seem to have some sort of conscious behavior. And so does Michael Levin. Those two guys, as biologists, look at these elements of consciousness not from a neurological neuromania perspective.
It certainly does. My way of wanting to think about it would be what kind of predictive processing is going on in very simple systems. Because if you take what I was talking about, then there's got to be some kind of model building for there to be something it's like to be. Now, does a very simple bacterium, which has a membrane, it's got an inside and its outside. In order to survive, it has to protect itself with the membrane. It has to allow certain things through the membrane and not others. So it, in a very, very, very simple sense, it's got a self and other. It's got, this is me and here and out there, not in a human sense, but that. And so I'm very much with the idea that consciousness is all over the place, really. And it's not something that we see. So many people in the field of consciousness studies are asking questions like, why did consciousness evolve? What is its function? If we've got consciousness, it must have evolved for a function. We've got to find the function. Well, on this view, there isn't any function of consciousness itself. There's a function of the whole system that is building these models and giving it the illusion that there's something separate. And then, questions like, there's a lot of very interesting, clever research on, when does a baby become, or an infant or a child become conscious? And again, my way of looking at it would be not like Nick Lane or who did you say,
Levin.
Michael Levin, but related. That it's there from the start. As soon as any system starts to separate itself off into self and other, then you would start to get this. But it would be very, very simple. It wouldn't be anything like our consciousness, and it's not something magic that's sort of added. And that's the thing we have to get away from. And I think, again, going back to Dan Dennett, he did a very good job of showing why we need to get away from that magic, and it's so alluring, and we shouldn't. Anil, you're talking about Anil Seth. He's I know him quite well. I saw him this summer at two conferences. I think he's doing fantastic work. He and I disagree, but he's one of the really interesting people that I love to talk to, and discuss the common ground and the differences and what have you. So that's encouraging for the field of consciousness study, even though I think most of it is mired in Cartesian materialism and doomed to failure. And I kind of watch it after 30 years. It's just over 30 years since this field really began, back in 1994. In your state of Arizona, with the first Tucson conference that happened then, that's 31 years ago. And I think people, well, about the case of wine between Christoph Koch and Dave Chalmers?
I actually don't. No.
Okay, well, it's a wonderful story, and you can look it up. But Christoph bet Dave, and sort of the whole world, if you like, must be 26, 27 years ago, something like that, that within 25 years we will have a good neurobiological explanation of consciousness. And he bet him a case of fine wine. Well, 25 years later, i.e. a couple of years ago, Koch had to give the case of wine, chose some wonderful wine, and gave it to Dave to great fanfare, because we have not done so. And we never will, in my opinion, because the way that it's put, I probably haven't got the exact words right, but the way that it's put is we need to understand how consciousness arises from brain activity. And that, the way I'm thinking, we will never find, because it's not like that. It is intrinsic to it. What it's like is whatever the model says it's like. That's what it is, for something to have a what it's like to be. And it's not the bat, it's the bat's model of the bat that is conscious.
So
Sorry, I don't think
fascinating.
I've answered your question at all. I rambled off. And as for Raymond Tallis, I haven't seen him for ages. I had a very difficult debate with him about 30 years ago or something. And I mean, he's a serious philosopher and I'm not. I can't work in the world of these clever philosophical positions. I found it very difficult. But I think you're perhaps better equipped to understand what he was talking about than me.
No, not at all. I really like hearing you speak, and I loved Raymond Tallis. He's been one of my favorite guests. He's a fascinating man that's thinking deeply, but just, from a philosophical standpoint. And I've had you for a while, but I'd love to ask you what your writing process is like. You've written pretty ferociously on the subject. I hear you smoke a little bit of cannabis to write. Like, how do you write?
Oh, I don't smoke cannabis to write. I smoke cannabis to have the ideas which will come out in the writing. So no, I'm not going to write stoned. That doesn't work. I suppose I might. Yeah, I could occasionally do. Yeah, I mean, I smoke my own homegrown stuff, which is not like as I understand it, nothing like the stuff you buy on the streets these days. But it inspires me to think differently. I like the way my mind kind of switches over into a different way of thinking. And I would say that most of my ideas that I've written about ever, in some way or another, have come from mostly cannabis, but to some extent from psychedelic experiences, and of course a lot from meditation or from my Zen practice. My writing process, I think, has changed a lot. I think now, in my age and at the moment not that well with the chronic fatigue and all that, I'm finding writing very hard. And I haven't written very much recently. I'm plodding along and finding it hard. But if I think about writing the meme machine, well, it differs if you ask me about different things. The nicest kind of writing is when it's all there somewhere in my head and all I have to do is sit down. Used to be with a pen and a old-fashioned typewriter with what's it called, that black paper stuff that you make copies out of, and then eventually a word processor. Wow! But I hope I will be able to write that way again sometime. It just flows. But I can give you a quite interesting example, which was the meme machine, because back in 1995, this is how the chronic fatigue began. I got two young kids. I'd got a new relationship, a full-time job. Life was incredibly stressful and full on. And I'd been out to Australia to do some lectures. And then I got back. It was the beginning of term. I got flu. I was ill. And I had to go somewhere and do a PhD examination. And on the way back, I got wet and cold in the rain. And I went to bed in the middle of the night. I got back. And in the morning, I couldn't get up. And I could get up just about enough to get to the loo and back to bed. But I mean, I was about 6 months of hardly able to walk at all, just like jelly, just, couldn't do anything. I was lying in bed nearly all the time. And gradually, after a year, I got okay again. Now, during that year, so this was 1995. That's when Dan Dennett's book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, came out. And that full of stuff about memes. And because I was reading that, I read so slowly because I would be lying in bed and I'd be awake and I'd read for about maybe 15 minutes and I would find that so exhausting. I had to put the book down and just lie there staring at the You can't sleep all the time, So you're just lying there staring at the ceiling and thinking over what I'd read. That took me to reread The Selfish Gene because I wanted to see the origin of the idea of memes. And the upshot of all that was I read those two books in about 9 months, and that's all I managed to read. I was that ill. I mean, really,
Wow.
there's no way I could have, had a laptop in bed or written. I was just cut off and I couldn't do anything really for months. By the end of that time, so I was well enough, sort of 9 months later, to go with wheelchair help at the airport and all that, to the 1996 Tucson conference and meet Dan Dennett for the first time. and tell him what I'd been thinking. By that time, I basically had a whole book in my head. It was all the ideas were there. So that when I met Dan, and he was wonderfully encouraging that I should write the book, and then Richard Dawkins helped me by putting me in touch with his editor who'd done The Selfish Gene. And although my book, this idea had been turned down by lots of publishers, my agent said, don't bother with this book, But anyway, it happened. But to answer your question, I just sat there and typed and typed and typed and typed, and it all flowed out. And I, wrote it within, I don't know how long, honestly, I can't remember, but certainly within a year, but it might have been 6 months, even though I'd got a job and everything else, because it was in there. That is the most joyful way to write for me. And I think I've probably spent too much in my time trying to write things when I'm not ready to write them, because I feel I ought to, or I've got enough of an idea to start, and then I get bogged down. I started writing a book called God's Memes, How Religions Evolved to Exploit Us and Why We Let Them, which would involve the biology of what the things we were talking about much earlier. And I just found myself hating writing. I was pushing myself too hard, and I wasn't flowing, and I think it would have been rubbish to read. And so I can't really answer your question now, because it's been a while. I've not been that well, and I've just moved house and a million other things happening. But I hope that inspiration will return, and I will again just find that the writing writes itself, really. That's when it's the most joyful.
Yeah, it sounds almost like I've heard people describe you're almost pregnant with an idea and you're giving birth to it when it's ready. And if you try prematurely, it's not going to work itself out. So it's an interesting metaphor.
Yes.
But
well, that metaphor describes it much better than my rambling I just had. So yes, thank you for that helpful metaphor. Quite right. And I'll remember that next time I'm thinking, oh God, yeah, go and do something else. Wait till it's ready.
You're funny. Well, I wanted to ask you one last question. I ask everybody, if you were going to die today, this was the last thing you could share with the world, and they couldn't read your books, your website didn't exist. Is there anything you'd like to say to the world?
Oh dear. I wish you'd primed me with this question beforehand.
It wouldn't be spontaneous then.
Well, I suppose I'm thinking, if I were going to die tomorrow, what would I do? Would I go out in my garden and spend the last time with living things out there? Would I I think I wouldn't sit in formal meditation all the time. Would that make me want to say to others, get on with your meditation? No, because I don't really want to tell other people what to do, because it doesn't suit everybody. And what was the question again? What would I want to tell the world? Now, I think I would think to myself, I've done all I can for the moment. I'm really sorry I'm going to die tomorrow, because I think there are lots of things in there, but they're not ready they're not ready to put out there yet. I'm happy, in a way, to hand over to the rest of you and not be here anymore. And good luck. Not a very helpful answer, is it?
No, it's great. It's a good way to prime a new pregnancy, maybe for some ideas that you have to get out quicker than later. Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for your time today. I know your energy is low these days, and you took the time to share this with people. So I do appreciate you. It was an honor.
You're very welcome. And yeah, I'm really tired now, but that was a good way to spend I can't have energy all day. So it's been a lot of it devoted to this, and I've enjoyed it. And you've asked very interesting questions. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it and subscribe to the show and rate the show. That helps people to discover it. And enjoy the next episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination of some sort.